I'm really happy to introduce our second speaker, Pia Melin. And Pia is senior curator in the Swedish History museums and researching and curating medieval and late medieval art. And Pia has written a lot about medieval art, about mural art, altarpieces, also have curated several exhibitions. And today she will talk about Västra Ed altarpiece, which is not as famous as St. Göran's sculpture group, but this is really interesting, a magnificent altarpiece. Late medieval from 1520s and has very many similar research questions what we have in our research project, especially with the Bollnäs altarpiece. But Pia is going to give a closer look on this object. Please, Pia.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. The mid-1800s had an explosive increase in population in Sweden. The medieval country churches were considered too small and outdated to meet the new demands. Many of the old churches were rebuilt or demolished and replaced with larger ones, mostly in neo-styles and with spacious interiors, with plenty of room for the parishioners. The construction of new, larger churches was actively supported and encouraged by the ecclesiastical authorities. One of all these churches was Ed's church, later named Västra Ed, in the region of Tjust in northeastern Småland. It had for centuries accumulated a considerable number of inventories, as wooden sculpture, textiles, and altarpieces. The church was built in the early 12th century and then consisted of a rectangular nave with an apse. The narrow portal with limestone capitals in the western part is preserved from this period. In the late 13th century, the church was extended with a transept that gave the church a cross-shaped plan, with a few counterparts in Sweden at that time. Perhaps the extension can be justified that the extra space was needed to serve as chapels. By many preserved wooden sculptures, one can assume that the church had several altars. A fragmentary sculpture of St. Michael slaying the dragon and a crucifix, both of high artistic quality, which you can see here. Nowadays, they are not so nice anymore, but once they were. They date from the 13th century, and during the 14th century, the chancel was rebuilt with a straight ending and a brick-clad portal in the south wall, and a sculpture of Saint Olav dates from this period. You can see him there. During the 15th century, the nave was vaulted, and north of the chancel, a sacristy was built. A small shrine with Saint Anne dates from this era. An older Madonna, dated dendrochronologically to between 1329 and 1339, was reworked during the end of the 15th century. And you can see her there. She has been written on a lot by Peter Tångeberg, that was mentioned earlier here. And this is very interesting because her veil was cut and reshaped into braids. And if you take a closer look at her head, you can notice that she originally had a crown on her head. So she has been reworked, and also the Jesus on her lap were given a late medieval expression to meet new aesthetical demands at the same time. From around 1500, a sculpture of St. Michael and a small shrine with St. Catherine of Alexandria is preserved. And all of these are of high quality and are amazingly well preserved when it comes to polychromy. The St. Michael pieces, this one and the one that you saw before, are very interesting because we have here two sculptures of the same saint from different eras and in different style from the same church. And here one can clearly spot the development of both stylistic features and of motives. The links to the local nobility is emphasized by the church's size, building materials, and different design to other parish churches in the neighborhood. The actual parish was in the Middle Ages important, both regional and national. Situated close to the church was the farm Vines, mentioned in the mid-14th centuries as Vyanäs. Magnus Carlsson Stjärna held the place from at least the 1320s, and it was sold in 1379 by his relatives to Bo Jonsson Grip, Privy Council and one of Sweden's richest men and largest landowner at the time. And you can see his signet here, together with the castle of Vines. And Vines is one of the oldest buildings in Småland, still standing. During the 1370s and 1380s, Bo Jonsson Grip bought large areas of land in the Tjust region, and his son Knut Boson Grip was probably the one who built Vines castle. And the castle has been in quite bad shape, but during the last 20 years, great efforts have been made to save the building from further decline. But it's still quite dangerous to go inside, and if you go inside, you have to wear a helmet to protect your head from falling stones. So it's in quite bad shape still. And during the ages, the Grip family held a strong position as patrons and donors of Ed's church. In the middle of the 19th century, the parish raised demands for a new church. They wanted a modern and spacious one that could house and better respond to the new conditions in the parish. In 1863, the new neo-Romanesque church, you can see here, made by architect Albert Törnqvist, was consecrated, and the old one was to remain untouched, with the inventories intact until the autumn of 1867, when the decision for demolition finally was taken. On demand from the Royal Swedish Academy of Letters, the Church Council decided to donate the large late medieval altarpiece together with those inventories that were considered worth preserving to Historiska museet in Stockholm. The attorney who made the trip to Ed and made the decision what to keep and bring to Stockholm was the national antiquarian Bror Emil Hildebrand. He had in 1840 pushed through a regulation that decisions on major renovations and demolitions of medieval churches in Sweden had to be examined by the Royal Academy of Letters. And the main purpose of this was to prevent the churches from being demolished without documentation and to prevent their inventories from being destroyed or dispersed. Thanks to this, many medieval inventories were saved, but despite this, many art historical treasures in Småland were lost due to demolition during the 19th century. And here you can see two examples of things that were lost, because it was especially when it comes to mural painting that we had great losses. And you can here see the late medieval paintings of Dalhem Church and the Romanesque paintings in Vrigstad Church that we nowadays, when we see them, can notice that it's a very excellent work, and that was probably the finest examples of Romanesque painting that we had in Sweden. And the problem was that a documentation was not really what we call a documentation today. They send out an artist to do some sketches, or they send a photographer to take one single photo of the church during demolition. And that's often the only things that we have kept today, to the present day. And we have the ruins from the church here. And Bror Emil Hildebrand, who held the position of National Antiquarian between 1837 and 1879, he made huge impact on the preservation of medieval churches and ecclesiastical art in Sweden. And thanks to him, his son Hans Hildebrand, mentioned by Herman earlier, and other art historians and antiquarians afterwards, Sweden holds one of the finest collections of medieval art in Europe today. And Bror Emil Hildebrand, he brought the altarpiece and several wooden sculptures and shrines to the museum in Stockholm. And after he left, the roof and the walls of a church were blown off, and the remainings were left on the ice of the nearby lake to sink in spring when the ice melted. The walls were covered with soil, and the remains of the church was left to decay as a ruin. And still the benches, pulpit, and many inventories were left inside the ruin. 14 years later, the church researcher Erik Irfors, that you can see here in the middle, he went to the church, and he was born in 1846, and he was a traveler. He traveled by foot, and he documented the churches of Småland and Östergötland. He was a very special man, regarded as somewhat strange by people who saw him. He was dressed in a homemade Franciscan robe, as you can see there. And he was one of the first people in the 19th century who converted to Catholicism in Sweden. He was one of the earliest examples of the upcoming Catholic movement that was more common in the 1910s and 1920s. He was autodidact in Latin, and he wrote the book Smålandia Sacra about the old medieval churches in Småland, and he illustrated the book with his own illustrations. And he was considered strange, but was greatly rewarded in his last years, and he got several medals for his work by documenting the old churches. But he describes his visit to the ruin in an indignant letter to the antiquarian authorities 14 years after the church was demolished. Because remainings of a pulpit, epitaphs, and medieval sculptures were lying together with pieces of human bones and parts of coffins scattered all around the inside of the ruins. And they were completely unprotected against both weather and vandalism. In 1910, began a cleanup of the ruin, and the church assembly then decided to sell some of the remainings, inventories, and some textiles to the Swedish Historiska museet. The museum demanded that the money should be used to restore the ruin, which at the time was completely overgrown with trees and bushes. And you can see the trees, large trees, growing inside the ruin. And the other picture is from I think 2 years later, when they have started to restore the ruins. And today, the ruin is still standing, and it is used for services during summer, and has been restored a couple of years ago, because it was again in quite bad shape, so it was dangerous to visit it. The collection from Västra Ed Church is unique in many aspects, both due to quantity and to quality. It is unusual that a Swedish museum holds so many items from one single church. In this case, 26 pieces, including a large coherent group of medieval wooden objects representing different stylistic phases and eras dating from the 13th to the 16th centuries. There are also several textiles dating from the Middle Ages to the 18th century. The collection is interesting from various aspects, both stylistic and contextual. Discussions could be held on both gender and hierarchical structures and the various ways these are manifested and communicated inside and outside church. Due to the preserved items, women seem to have played an important role, both as donors and as recipients of cult and worship. The four virgin saints and the Holy Kinship are depicted on the wings of the large altarpiece from 1526, and on the small shrine of St. Catherine, we meet the four virgins again. St. Catherine is also depicted on a late medieval chasuble, together with Agnes, Barbara, and Virgin Mary as the apocalyptical woman, as you see there. We also know that the parish women active participated as donors of liturgical vestments after the Reformation. Particularly interesting are two altarpieces in the collection, both closely connected to the Grip family. A small Renaissance altar, you can see here, made for private devotion and later donated to the church, and a large altarpiece made in 1526 for the high altar. Both contain motifs of a quite advanced level that points to a specific taste and knowledge among the local nobility, the Grip family, who first ordered and then donated the actual objects. When the altarpieces were donated to the church, their depictions and stories received a new and wider public. The choices of subject mirror the donator's private taste and generate new ideas and thoughts on religious beliefs among the parishioners through the presence of the items. The taste and choice of some privileged few became then, in this way, public and spread more widely to new groups of people. The boundaries between private and public religious practice were then altered. The small Renaissance alabaster shrine was donated by the Grip family. The relief and the surrounding figures and ornaments are mounted in a small wooden shrine that has the Grip coats of arms on one of the wings. And according to its small size, it was probably intended as a house altar for private worship. The motive is unusual for an altar, as it shows Lot and his daughters. Based on its stylistic features, it was probably made in the second half of the 16th century. The central piece is carved in low relief with painted and gilded details. The architectural framework is ornated with mascarons and putti, holding garlands, and a caryatid and a herm carved in full rounded sculpture. The alabaster work might be of Flemish origin. The stonework was probably imported and later mounted in the wooden shrine locally. The shrine was probably ordered by Birger Nilsson Grip to Wienes. He held many prestigious offices as Privy Council from 1521 and governor in Småland from 1531 to 59. The shrine lacks the coat of arms of his wife Britta Joakimsdotter Brahe, who died in 1554. Britta was a niece of King Gustav Vasa. Her mother Margareta Eriksdotter Vasa died here in Tallinn in 1536 and is buried in front of the high altar in the cathedral. The alabaster shrine was probably commissioned after her death, perhaps to commemorate Birger Nilsson's appointment to baron in 1561. This seemed plausible as an altar of the same type in Nationalmuseet in Copenhagen, donated by Herluf Trolle and Birgitte Gøye, is dated to 1560. Perhaps he commissioned the piece of art in Ostfriesen, where he traveled in 1561 on a royal appointment. Birger Nilsson Grip and Britta Joachimsdotter Brahe were buried in Ed, but their tombstone, ordered from Denmark, was never placed on their grave. For unknown reasons, probably because of the Nordic 7 Years' War, it never reached its destination. It was later found in a field in northern Skåne and placed on the wall of Grumlösa Church in 19th century. The donator's interest is also notable and visible in the focus of this paper, the large altarpiece from 1526 that we see here. It's an altarpiece that kept its place on the high altar even after the Reformation 1 year later and until the church was torn down in 1867. When open, we see a large crucifixion scene in corpus surrounded by carved depictions of the Passion of Christ and the time after the crucifixions inside the wings. When the inner wings are closed and the outer ones are open, you see 4 female saints in relief standing on corbels against a background of painted draperies. From left to right, we see Barbara, Mary Magdalene, Dorothea, and Margaret. In the 1920s, the date 1526 could still be read on Mary Magdalene's anointing vessel. You can see it on the black and white picture over there. And this inscription is nowadays almost faded. So you can see in the picture here, taken in the mid-1990s by Lennart Karlsson, the inscription is almost totally vanished. The top of the wings holds smaller depictions of 4 apostles and 2 saints. We can see Peter, Paul, John, James the Great, Lawrence, and Stephen on top. And when fully closed, a painted depiction of the Holy Kinship with the Annunciation on top are visible. And the composition of the Holy Kinship is typically late medieval, where the Holy Family and the relatives are placed in front of and behind a wall with a city view as a backdrop. Behind the wall, we can see Joachim, Cleophas, and Salomas, the 3 husbands of Anne, together with Joseph and the Virgin Mary's 2 sisters and their 5 children, Jesus' cousins. As the altarpiece was closed most of the year and only opened occasionally, this was probably the motif that faced the churchgoers for most of the year. The paintings are done in a rather distinctive and somewhat naive style, where the facial features of the figures are small and slightly crooked. And some of the bodies have also a slightly unnatural twist. The paintings here are somewhat reminiscent of the sculptures in an altarpiece from around 1520 from Hägersta in Östergötland, where we can spot the same kind of distortions in the bodies and narrow facial features with close-set eyes and small mouths and with thin lips. And sometimes the lips are just a thin line, always a bit crooked. The altarpiece here is probably a copy of a 15th century northern German altarpiece from the same church. And as there is a short distance, only 67 kilometers between the 2 churches in Ed and Hägersta, and the altarpieces are quite similar in time, there might be an artistic connection here. Another interesting fact is the choice of materials. Here we have pine wood and lime wood used together, and the same material are used in the large altarpiece from Västra Ed. The altarpiece from Västra Ed is extremely well preserved, with most of its original polychrome and gilding intact. The dominant colors are green, gold, red, and blue. And the carved ornamental decoration on top of it. The Gesprengwerk is also preserved intact, something extremely rare in preserved altarpieces in Swedish collections. The frame of the altarpiece is made of pine wood, the tracery of oak, and the sculptures are carved in hardwood, probably lime wood. Other materials are also used. For example, are the acanthus ornaments made by tin, and small branches of tree are used as spikes in the crown of thorns. And the size of the altarpiece is impressive. It's 440 centimeters high and 350 centimeters wide open. The painted predella, with its curved sides, shows Saint George slaying the dragon. The depiction is surrounded by ornaments with wines and urns in a typical Antiquarian Renaissance style. The strict style of the ornament forms a sharp contrast to the clumsier execution of the legend in the middle. Due to stylistic features, we can conclude that the painter is the same one who has painted the wings of the altarpiece. This person has most certainly also painted the small shrine of Saint Catherine in the same collection. The sculpture dates from the late 14th century, but the painting on the shrine were made later in a style like the ones on the large altarpiece. That a modernization of the shrine has taken place is interesting when we know that the earlier mentioned Madonna was remade at one point to meet new aesthetical ideals. And the shape of the predella is also quite unusual, as you can see here. And the ornaments here are strictly Renaissance style. And even the backside of the predella is interesting in its own way, as it holds graffiti and sketches of different figures. And these are not visible today, as the altarpiece is located close to a wall, but probably in church. It was standing so you could get behind it, because if you look at the style of the figure's clothes here, we can conclude that most of the sketches here were made in the 17th century. So it's quite interesting. For example, we can see a quite naive sketch of Christ over there. We have a woman standing and we have a boat in a landscape, and lots of small signatures and so on. The altarpiece has two coats of arms in corpus, one with a griffin and one with a frontal troll face, alluding to the families Grip and Trolle. The altarpiece was probably commissioned by Anna Arvidsdotter Trolle, who was born in 1476 and died in 1532. It was probably commissioned by her in memory of her late husband Nils Boson Grip, 1460 to 1522, knight and marshal of the realm, and from 1512, county chief administrator in Tjust. Nils Boson Grip was murdered in 1522, and it is most likely that the altarpiece was commissioned by his wife shortly after the murder as a gift of God, to God and for the salvation of her husband's soul. The Grip family continued even after Reformation to have great influence in the parish, and the family coat of arms were still to be found on items in the church. Fines remained in the family's ownership until 1616, when it by marriage went over to the Levenhaupt family. A worn and damaged velvet antependium was among the items left in the ruin in 1867, and the fabric has suffered a lot from weather and wind. In 1910, it was sold to the museum, and the year 1623 is applied on it together with the Grip and Levenhaupt coats of arms. The family of Venus still held their old and strong patronship in Ed Church. And old traditions and rituals were also strong. This is Erik Irfors, a painting, sketch made after him by another artist that shows what the church looked inside in the 1860s. And from 1860, we have a written record that tells that the Madonna was still in situ at church beside the large altarpiece. All the smaller shrines with saints also remained in the church until 1867. The record of information provided by parishioner Lars Magnus Svensson also mentions that the large altarpiece was opened at the time of Passion to show the inner scenes, and that a choir bell in the chancel arch was rung during communion. These customs are purely Catholic, and this occurring in a Swedish Protestant church in the middle of the 19th century is truly remarkable. The style of the altarpiece is somewhat puzzling. The first overall impression is that an attempt was made to imitate a Flemish altarpiece, with its many scenes of varying size and its diversity of figures. It also shows an exciting mixture of medieval and Renaissance expressions when it comes to both style and choice of motives, and creates an unbroken line of faith and piety over time. The carved reliefs inside the altarpiece have a focus on the Passion of Christ, the crucifixion, and the events happening after. In the middle of corpus, the large crucifixion scene is surrounded by the carrying of the cross, Christ before Pilate, the crowning of thorns, and the mocking of Christ. The insides of the wings show the descending from the cross and the resurrection, surrounded by smaller scenes depicting the events happening after. On top of the inner wings are carved depictions of the meetings of Mary and Elizabeth and of Joachim and Anne. Of particular interest are some of the smaller motifs not very common in medieval altarpieces in Sweden. We can find the road to Emmaus, we can find the dinner in Emmaus, and the Noli me tangere with Mary Magdalene meeting Christ after his resurrection. These motifs are more common in post-reformatory art in Sweden. There is also a depiction of a parade of devils making music with knuckles, and one of them plays the drums using bones as drumsticks. Another is the one showing Judas Iscariot, who has committed suicide by hanging, and the purse with the 30 silver coins hangs around his neck, and his belly has burst, and his entrails have fallen out. This motive is very unusual in altarpieces in Sweden, but more common in murals from the late 15th and early 16th century. The style of the carved figures is characterized by strong contrasts and direct opposites when one compares the larger scenes with the smaller ones. In the smaller scenes, most of the figures are short with sturdy bodies and large heads, while the ones in the larger scenes have an almost manneristic design with elongated and almost spider-like body parts. And you can notice this, for example, in the hands. The fingers are extremely long here, while in the smaller scenes, they have really short and sturdy bodies with often very, very fat thighs. And the faces of the figures here are flat and broad with sharp features and hair executed in both mannered and non-realistic styles as more realistic hairstyles. The style of the carved figures resembles another interesting item preserved from the actual church, the small sculpture of Job sitting on the ash heap. The sculpture can be dated to the early 16th century and has later been interpreted both as Job and as Christ in waiting. Job seems more accurate, though, as the figure is sitting on a small hill and the attached chair is a later addition, probably from the 17th century. The sculpture was also referred to as a Job in 1860 when the sculptures were collected by Hildebrand. Job is not a common motive in medieval sculpture, but there are actually a few murals from around 1500 showing him being tormented by the devil. The motive has more of a post-reformative character in Sweden, and an altar dedicated to Job was documented in Kalmar Storkyrka in 1533, and we know that there were strong connections between Kalmar and Ed and Vinäs at the time. Maybe there was also an altar dedicated to Job in Ed's church. The altarpiece cannot be linked with certainty to any known workshop nor place of production. It has been referred to either as a work of an unknown workshop, to an anonymous South German sculptor working in Sweden, or connected to the works of the so-called Immaculata master. None of these attributions are rather satisfying. There are stylistic links to works attributed to the Immaculata master, as the altarpiece from Funbo, you can see here. You can see that in Funbo, in the altarpiece there, you have the four virgins here, almost exactly as in the altarpiece from Västra Ed. And this is what the Funbo altarpiece looks like inside. You have some similarities here with motifs, but it differs a lot in style when you take a closer look at the carving of the figures. And we also have the altarpiece, Madonna piece from Sånga Church in Ångermanland that is attributed to the Immaculata Master as well. And here you have the two virgin saints of the wings that are very Flemish in style and similar to both the ones in Funbo and in Västra Ed. And in the middle you see the Madonna and the infant Jesus. And as I told you, some parts match here while others don't. And it is worth noticing that there are also stylistic connections to artworks from southern Sweden as well. Parts that during the Middle Ages were Danish. And both the altarpieces in Hanhals Church from the early 16th century and in Tving in Blekinge from the same time shows stylistic similarities to the Mannerist figures in the altarpiece from Västra Ed. And if you take a close look at the figures, the carved figures in Tving, they show stylistic similarities to Västra Ed as well. And what if the altarpiece in Västra Ed is connected both to the Immaculata Master and to the South Scandinavian style? It is most likely executed in Sweden, but with strong influences from southern Scandinavia, Germany, and with a distinctive Flemish touch. Perhaps it's the most reasonable way to consider the altarpiece from Västra Ed, a typical example of how different styles and traditions mixes and creates something purely unique that just not can be linked to any particular master or creator. It seems like masters from different areas and traditions have worked together in the same way as in the Bollnäs altarpiece. Thank you.
Then I continue.
Yeah.
The Västra Ed altarpiece it's made of different wood species. You mentioned tree. Have you looked or your information how usual it was in this period? Do you have any other examples from your own collection, for example?
There are quite many, but those are often referred to as Swedish work. And it has been told that if you find something else that's not oak, then it's Swedish, because if it's oak, it's from Lübeck or northern Germany. And I think the main problem with this altarpiece is that there is not much research done on it. And I think it's mainly because of that it has been considered very problematic, because you get crazy when you start looking at it, because it has so many similarities with things that you can't just tie it up. And I think probably you have lots of people working from different areas, working together, perhaps in Sweden. And I don't think anyone has taken a closer look at the South Scandinavian connection, because if you take a look at the Twing altarpiece, there are similarities with Klaus Berg, for example, the workshop of him. So I think it's good to take a closer look at the link in between South Scandinavian style, because we know that there are connections to Denmark with the Greek family. So I think it's still a lot to do with this altarpiece.
Do you have any research about the southern Swedish workshops? Because Stockholm and Arboga have mentioned...
Yes, we have Stockholm, we have Arboga, and it's not similar to none of the Swedish workshops that we know. So it's the Immaculata master that is the closest one, but you can see traces of him in the altarpiece from Västra Ed, but you can't attribute it to him.
About Job, yeah, we have Finnish Job in our exhibition, and I knew that, as you said, in Sweden it is quite uncommon topic, but in Finland it was not popular, but they have quite many examples, mostly from late medieval period. So I have discussed this earlier little with Elina, that maybe this, if you are looking at Finnish material, that's Job had a special place there. Maybe in the future, if you think about iconography, it's good to have in mind. And I think it was Sixten Ringbom in 1970s who wrote about Finnish Job sculptures. Then I thank you from all my heart, Pia and Herman, for these very interesting papers, for coming to share this with all of us. And see you soon again. Ja lähen eesti keele üle. Suur aitäh, et te tulite. Ja ootame teid juba 2 nädala pärast siia samasse Nigulistesse meie konverentsile. Suur aitäh ja näeme varsti.